Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to a podcast series about a book that I wrote. I am your host and author of the forthcoming book titled Held Back, Anthony Corby. And so, in this podcast series, I'm going to be doing basically something similar to what I did with Empty. I'm going to be talking about different topics with each podcast, going over my synopsis, inspiration, all that good stuff. Let me actually give you the topics real quick. So, in this episode, I'm going to be giving you a background of how I came up with the idea and also a background of what's been going on the past year in terms of books and stuff for me. And then the second episode, like I said, is going to be synopsis and inspiration. I'm combining that into one episode. Episode 3 is going to be a little bit different. So last time when I was doing the podcast series for Empty, I devoted a whole episode to talking about the cover. But there's really not that much special about the cover. I mean, it's really just me, and it's you're supposed to infer that it's the main character of the story, and he's standing out front of a school building. There's no major symbolism or anything like there was with Empty. I felt like I had to describe all the objects because that was such a big part of that cover and of that book. But there's really not that much to describe with the cover for Held Back. It's pretty straightforward. And then I'm going to finish this podcast series, episode 4, the same way I finished with the Empty podcast by reading a little bit from the book itself. So that should be fun. Um, so anyway, make sure that you are following me on Instagram at acorbybooks. There will be a lot more updates on uh, held back on the release and stuff like that. And there actually might even be a fifth podcast sometime down the line. But follow at A Corby Books on Instagram, ACORBI Books, because I'm going to be releasing a lot of updates and stuff there. So these podcasts are going to run every Friday at 8 p.m. through May 7th. The following Friday, May 14th, is the release of the book itself. The cost is going to be $7.95. It's only a little bit more expensive than Empty, but it's probably about 80% longer. So I think Empty was 80 pages, something like that. This one's 150. So the cost is just a little bit higher for this one, but should be I think it's pretty reasonable. Anyway, let me give you a background of the past year. How did I come up with this idea? And well, first of all, what happened after February 1st? Because that was the day of the first and last book signing of the Empty Tour. Uh, so I'm going to be going over that first. So basically, I had that signing at Barnes and Noble. That was awesome for multiple reasons. I was going to that Barnes and Noble. It was a Barnes and Noble in Morristown. Uh, and my mom and I had been going to that Barnes and Noble. We used to go on either Saturday or Sunday, pretty much every Saturday or Sunday, since we moved from our old house down in Gloucester County up to our current house in Burlington County. So we would go there, uh, yeah, like pretty much every weekend. I would either read a book or do homework or something, depending on the time of year and depending on how much work I had to do. I would get a snack and we would sit at one of the tables. So it was really cool to be there and be signing books, like in a place where I spent so much time, um, you know, reading myself. Uh, one of the chairs in the cafe, and then all of a sudden I'm a host of an event at the Barnes and Noble. And it wasn't just me. There were a ton of other authors. I met a lot of other great authors there, and that was a fun experience. Um, so yeah, and after that, I began to reach out to some more bookstores to host some more. I had emails. I called a bunch of bookstores, wrote down a bunch of emails, especially for Barnes and Nobles over Burlington County, Gloucester County, even up in Mercer County near TCNJ, I think. I emailed them. And then I was emailing them probably the first week of March, and then the next week, well, we all know what happened after that. COVID-19 hit, everything shut down. For me, the day was March 12th, so it's actually funny. I know this isn't really about the book, it's more about something else I was working on, but I launched a business on March 6th. I believe that was the day that the business launched. Um, and I was running an ad campaign about a week later. I think I started it on March 9th or 10th. And then March 12th was the day for me that everything shut down because all the sports started to get suspended. Um, all of the or the stock market was dropping that day. We were getting emails from the school about potential plans, for remote education, stuff like that, like dates and stuff. And I was like, okay, well, time to shut this down. And then I just really never came back to it because I don't want to be running a videography business, especially one where you got to get close and personal with people and be around lots of people. I didn't want to be doing that in the midst of all this. And honestly, the business itself was getting to be, or it was becoming something that I didn't really want it to become anyway. So that's that's just a funny story about things that were going on. The book was kind of like supposed to be a precursor to something that was better, and I learned something at the book signing from one of the other authors, and I was thinking about like how it could apply to me, and I was like, I've always wanted to launch this business for a while, and then the business idea kind of became something different from what I wanted it to be. Um, so then I wound up shutting it down, partially because of that, but mostly because, there was I don't know, a big pandemic going on. So that's why the business eventually shut down. But, anyways, back to writing. So last spring, I started writing probably the goriest book on the face of the earth, and I hated writing it. I had this decent idea uh, for this really just gory, disgusting book about basically like COVID, but worse, like a lot worse. And I hated writing it, and I thought that this was like really stupid, but I was trying to make something groundbreaking. I was thinking like Empty was good, but let's make something like really groundbreaking. Like the world should fear stuff like this. And I started writing this book, and I was like, this is so awful for multiple reasons. First of all, I didn't understand a lot of what I was talking about. It required a lot of research and stuff. I had like 8 tabs open trying to figure out if something like this could work. And when I was telling the idea to my friend who's a major in science or in one of the science department fields, he was kind of laughing at it. This was months later, but he was kind of laughing at like how weird it was and how like the science didn't really check out. Um, so anyway, I moved on from that. I wrote a chapter synopsis for another book last spring, which was a coming of age story. Um, but I didn't really feel inspired to write more than a couple of pages of it. Usually, when I sit down to write a book, it has to, there has to be something right out of the gate. I think that happens that's substantial. Otherwise, I kind of lose interest. And so I wrote the first couple of pages, but I wasn't really like interested in writing the rest of it. It wasn't moving fast enough, and I didn't think it was actually even going to be that long. And if I rushed through it, it probably would have been like 60 pages tops. Um, so I really didn't feel that inspired to keep writing it, but I did take some of the ideas from the main character of that book and incorporated them into this book, which was the idea of the main character, and it was a coming of age story about a college student. And the college student wasn't really that big of a fan of school, but also just it wasn't too much about school. It was more about he didn't really like the people that he went to school with. Um, and so I wound up incorporating kind of that idea into Held Back, which is obviously a book about school. Um, so I started thinking after writing that about maybe like a comedy book or something. And I started actually writing a book just before winter break started. And I forced myself to keep writing it because I wanted to publish something in 2021. Um, and so I sat down and I kept forcing myself to write it, even if I was just writing like a few paragraphs at a time. But it really wasn't something that I wanted to complete. But I mean, I might still publish it in the future. I don't know. It's not really a, I wouldn't call it a coming of age story like this, but it was more just comedy. I'm not going to give away too many details about it, but I wrote 3 chapters and then 2 paragraphs of the fourth chapter in total, and then I stopped writing it pretty much exactly, I think on Christmas Day was the last day that I wrote something from that book, which is a good segue into the next thing that I want to talk about, which is how I started to write this book, a uh, pretty much a few days later. So all of December, I'd been listening to um, an album called A Christmas Carol by a band that I just discovered called Majestica. And it was like a power metal band, and they basically made power metal. They made a power metal Christmas album based off of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. And then I watched the Muppets movie version, and I was thinking, I would think while watching the movie or while listening to the album, like how how good the original story was, and how I didn't think anybody could make something like it without ripping it off. But, I was kind of thinking about that all month, and then I was thinking, okay, well, how could you make a book like this, like like how could you make a book with a character who goes through things like this, and then at the other end, uh, you know, is better or something like that, is a better person. And then I thought, well, it's basically at the root, it's just a coming of age story. And so I was like, I was thinking to myself, okay, well, I mean, I can try to write a coming of age story. I mean, the last book, the comedy book, was kind of like that. It wasn't really a coming of age story, like I said, but it was kind of like that. So I was like, okay, well, let me take some ideas of this, some ideas from that book I mentioned that I started writing last spring, which was also a coming of age story, and let me try to add parts of my own high school experience and make a book about a kid who's in high school. And then the result was the book titled Held Back, to be released May 14th. So that's all I'm going to talk about for this episode. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Held Back podcast. I'm Anthony Corby. Remember, the links will be down in the description for Instagram and Spotify, if Spotify is more your speed, if you're watching this on YouTube. And then if you are listening to this on Spotify, my YouTube, where I'm publishing these, is youtube.com/mancavestudios1. So anyway, thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope to see you next Friday.